In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, a small fire broke out in a bakery on a narrow street near London Bridge. The kind of fire that started in London's cramped wooden city almost every week without much consequence. This one did not go out. Over the following 4 days, it grew into an inferno that destroyed roughly 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and the ancient Cathedral of St. Paul's, leaving perhaps 100,000 people homeless in a city of only about 400,000, and permanently reshaping the physical and legal landscape of one of the largest cities in the world. This is the story of the Great Fire of London, the baker whose oven likely started it, the diarists who recorded it in extraordinary detail, and the innocent man who was hanged for a crime that was in truth an accident of wind, timber, and bad luck. To understand why a single kitchen fire could grow into a catastrophe of this scale, you first have to understand the city that London had become by the middle of the 17th century. London in 1666 was a city still built largely as it had been for centuries, a dense maze of narrow, winding streets lined with timber-framed buildings, many of them constructed with upper floors that jettied out over the street below, sometimes coming close enough to buildings on the opposite side that residents could reportedly shake hands across the gap from their windows. These overhanging upper stories dramatically reduced the width of already narrow lanes at street level, while at the same time creating an environment perfectly suited to the rapid spread of fire, since flames could leap easily from one jutting upper floor to the building facing it across the street. Adding further danger, the city was in the grip of an unusually hot, dry summer in 1666, following a prolonged drought that had left London's densely packed wooden structures, many caulked with tar and pitch, and roofed with flammable thatch or wooden shingles, despite decades of regulations attempting, with only partial success, to phase such materials out in an extremely combustible state. London had also, in the year immediately preceding the fire, endured a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, the Great Plague of 1665, which killed an estimated 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population, a catastrophe still fresh in the memory and daily life of Londoners as the fire began, and one that had already left the city's social and economic fabric under considerable strain even before a new disaster struck. The fire is believed to have begun in the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, at the bakery of Thomas Farriner, located on Pudding Lane, a narrow street close to London Bridge in the historic heart of the city. Farriner served, among his other duties, as a supplier of ship's biscuit to the Royal Navy, and his bakery, like most commercial premises of the era, combined his business with his family's living quarters on the premises. The precise cause of the fire has never been definitively established, though the most widely accepted explanation among historians holds that a spark from Farriner's bread oven, perhaps not fully extinguished before the household retired for the night, ignited nearby stored fuel, likely firewood or faggots kept close to the oven for the next day's baking, sometime after midnight. Farriner and his family, upon discovering the fire, managed to escape their burning home by climbing out of an upstairs window and along adjoining rooftops to reach safety in a neighboring building, though tragically their maidservant, reportedly too frightened of the rooftop escape route to attempt it herself, remained inside and became, as far as historical records indicate, the fire's first confirmed fatality, one of remarkably few directly recorded deaths from a disaster that would go on to destroy such an enormous portion of the city. A low official death toll, historians have long suspected, likely undercounts the true human cost, since the fire almost certainly killed additional poor and undocumented Londoners whose deaths went unrecorded amid the chaos, their remains potentially consumed entirely in the intense heat generated by the blaze. Much of what we know about the fire's progression in vivid, immediate detail comes from the diary of Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator and member of Parliament whose extensive personal diary, covering the years from 1660 to 1669, provides one of the richest first-hand accounts of daily life in Restoration-era London to survive to the present day. Pepys was awakened in the early hours of September 2nd by a servant who alerted him to a fire visible in the distance, but seeing the blaze from a distance and judging it no more alarming than the ordinary fires that broke out with some regularity across London's crowded streets, he initially returned to bed without particular concern, a decision that, in hindsight, reflected just how unremarkable the fire's earliest hours had seemed even to an unusually observant contemporary witness. By morning, however, the fire's rapid and unchecked spread had become impossible to ignore. Pepys traveled by boat along the Thames to get a clearer view of the blaze, and later that same day made his way to the royal court to personally inform King Charles II of the fire's alarming progress, reporting that London's Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, had, when initially summoned to the scene the previous night, dismissed the danger with a now infamous remark, reportedly declaring that a woman might piss it out before returning to his own bed, a catastrophic failure of civic leadership at the precise moment when decisive early action might still have contained the blaze. As the fire's danger grew clearer to him over the course of that first full day, Pepys took the now famous step of burying his most prized possessions, including a substantial store of wine and a wheel of Parmesan cheese, in a pit dug in his garden, a small, almost domestic detail that has endured in popular memory of the fire, precisely because it captures, in such a human and relatable way, the desperate improvisation of ordinary Londoners trying to save what they could as an uncontrollable disaster bore down on their city. Pepys was not alone in leaving behind a vivid first-hand account. The diarist and writer John Evelyn, another prominent contemporary observer, also recorded his own harrowing impressions of the fire in his own diary, describing the air itself as thick with smoke for miles around the burning city, and the ground so hot in places that it scorched the souls of those attempting to walk through the smoldering ruins even days after the flames themselves had passed. Vivid first-hand testimony that, alongside Pepys's own writing, remains one of the primary sources historians still rely upon to reconstruct the fire's day-by-day, and at times hour-by-hour, progression through the city. The critical failure in London's initial response centered on a firefighting technique that was, in 1666, the standard and only truly effective method available for stopping a major urban fire, the deliberate demolition of buildings in the fire's path to create fire breaks, gaps wide enough that flames could not leap across them to reach the next row of structures. Under the legal customs of the era, however, officials generally required the consent of property owners before their buildings could be torn down, even in the interest of stopping a spreading fire. And Lord Mayor Bloodworth, lacking the authority or perhaps simply the will to override these property rights and order demolitions on his own initiative in those crucial early hours, hesitated at exactly the moment when swift, decisive action might have prevented the disaster that followed, a delay of mere hours that, given the fire's subsequent explosive growth, likely made an enormous difference in the ultimate scale of destruction. Compounding this failure of early leadership, a strong easterly wind was blowing across London on the day the fire began, and continued through much of the following days, driving the flames westward through the city with tremendous and largely unstoppable force, carrying burning debris and sparks well ahead of the main fire front, and igniting new blazes at a pace that consistently outstripped the ability of Londoners, working without any organized professional fire brigade, since none yet existed in the city, to respond, relying instead on primitive leather buckets, hand-operated water pumps called squirts, and long-hooked poles used to pull burning thatch from rooftops, tools and techniques entirely inadequate to the scale of fire that was now spreading across the city. King Charles II himself, according to several contemporary accounts, went further still than simply delegating authority to his brother, personally joining firefighting efforts at various points during the crisis, reportedly working alongside ordinary Londoners, passing buckets of water, and helping to demolish buildings in the fire's path. A hands-on royal involvement that, whatever its practical impact on the fire itself, was widely noted and favorably remembered by contemporaries as a rare and reassuring display of direct royal engagement with the suffering of his subjects during a moment of genuine citywide crisis. By the second day of the fire, Monday, September 3rd, the blaze had grown into a genuine citywide catastrophe, and King Charles II, recognizing that municipal authorities under Bloodworth had lost effective control of the situation, took the significant step of placing his own brother, James, Duke of York, in direct command of the firefighting effort, a decision that finally brought more decisive and better organized action to the crisis. James established firefighting posts staffed by soldiers and citizens at various points around the fire's perimeter, and crucially began authorizing the systematic demolition of buildings to create effective fire breaks, the very measure that earlier civic hesitation had delayed, though even this more decisive action struggled, for a time, to keep pace with a fire that continued to grow and spread with alarming speed. The fire's most dramatic and symbolically devastating moment came with the destruction of Old St. Paul's Cathedral, the massive medieval church that had stood at the heart of London for centuries, and that many Londoners had initially believed, given its enormous stone construction, would surely prove impervious to the flames. St. Paul's had, in fact, been serving as a temporary refuge for both people and property during the fire, its interior packed with furniture, books, and other valuables that Londoners believed would be safe within its ancient stone walls, along with scaffolding erected as part of ongoing renovation work being conducted on the building at the time. Tragically, this very scaffolding likely helped doom the cathedral, providing fuel that allowed flames to catch hold of the building's exterior. And on the night of September 4th, the cathedral's roof, its lead sheathing melting in the extreme heat and pouring down into the streets below in molten rivulets, according to horrified eyewitness accounts, ultimately collapsed entirely, gutting the ancient structure and destroying, along with it, the vast quantities of goods and valuables that desperate Londoners had stored inside, believing them safe. By the fourth day of the fire, Wednesday, September 5th, the combination of more effective fire breaks, a fortunate shift and eventual weakening of the powerful winds that had driven the blaze's earlier explosive spread, and the sheer exhaustion of available fuel in the areas the fire had already consumed, finally allowed firefighters and soldiers to bring the flames under control, and by September 6th, the fire was essentially extinguished, though scattered small fires and smoldering cellars, particularly in areas where coal and other combustible materials had been stored underground, reportedly continued to burn or smolder for weeks afterward. The physical devastation the fire left behind was almost incomprehensible in scale. Contemporary estimates, later analyses generally confirming the broad figures, suggest the fire destroyed roughly 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, in addition to St. Paul's Cathedral itself, and a wide range of other significant structures, including the Royal Exchange, Guildhall, and numerous livery company halls, consuming an area of the historic city walls estimated at roughly 436 acres, or approximately 80% of the entire walled city of London as it then existed, though the fire did stop short of engulfing the Tower of London, where residents and soldiers successfully fought to prevent its spread, in part by using gunpowder to create particularly wide and effective fire breaks around the ancient fortress. Remarkably, given the sheer scale of physical destruction, the officially recorded death toll from the fire itself remained extraordinarily low, with only a handful of deaths directly documented in contemporary records, though, as with the Ferriner's maidservant, historians have long suspected the true toll, particularly among London's poorest residents, was considerably higher than official records, focused primarily on identifiable and propertied citizens, ever managed to capture. In the weeks and months that followed, the roughly 100,000 Londoners left homeless by the fire faced a genuinely desperate humanitarian crisis, with many forced to camp in makeshift shelters in open fields surrounding the city, including large temporary encampments established in moorfields and other open spaces north of the old city walls, while the government and city authorities worked to organize emergency food supplies and, eventually, longer-term rebuilding efforts. One curious and still debated historical footnote concerns the fire's apparent, if entirely unintentional, effect on the plague that had so recently devastated the city since the destruction of so many of London's oldest, most cramped and rat-infested buildings, along with the rebuilding regulations that followed requiring brick and stone construction less hospitable to the rodent and flea populations that spread plague, may have contributed to the fact that London never again experienced an outbreak of bubonic plague on anything approaching the scale of the 1665 epidemic, though historians continue to debate how much credit for this the fire itself genuinely deserves as opposed to other contributing factors of the era. In the fire's immediate aftermath, amid widespread fear, displacement, and a desperate search for explanation, public suspicion turned toward foreigners and religious minorities, particularly French and Dutch residents of London, nations with which England happened to be at war at the time, amid a swirl of largely baseless rumors that the fire had been a deliberate act of arson, part of a foreign or Catholic conspiracy against the English nation, rumors that in several documented instances led to genuine mob violence against innocent foreign residents caught up in the panic and suspicion of those first chaotic days. This search for a scapegoat found its most tragic outlet in the case of Robert Hubert, a mentally unstable French watchmaker who, under circumstances that remain disputed but that many historians believe involved either genuine delusion or coercion, confessed to deliberately starting the fire, claiming to have thrown a fireball through the window of Ferriner's bakery. Hubert's confession contained numerous inconsistencies, including claims that conflicted with basic known facts about the bakery's layout, and it later emerged that he had not even been in London when the fire began, having arrived in the city only after the blaze was already well underway, a fact that should have been sufficient to clear him entirely. Despite these glaring inconsistencies, and despite even Thomas Ferriner himself reportedly expressing doubt about Hubert's guilt, Hubert was tried, convicted, and hanged at Tyburn in October 1666, an innocent man executed to satisfy a public desperate for someone, anyone, to hold responsible for a catastrophe that had, in reality, almost certainly originated as a tragic accident. An official parliamentary investigation conducted in the aftermath of the fire ultimately concluded, based on the available evidence, that the fire had indeed been an accident, the product of the era's cramped and flammable urban construction, combined with extraordinarily dry conditions and powerful winds, rather than any deliberate conspiracy, a conclusion that modern historians examining the same evidence have generally continued to endorse, viewing Hubert's execution as a grave miscarriage of justice, driven by the understandable but misguided need of a traumatized population to identify a responsible villain rather than accept the harder truth that disaster had struck simply through unfortunate and largely impersonal circumstance. The rebuilding of London that followed the fire became one of the most significant urban planning challenges of the era, drawing proposals from several of the leading architects and thinkers of the day, most famously Christopher Wren, who submitted an ambitious plan for a substantially redesigned city featuring wide, geometrically ordered boulevards radiating from central plazas in a style influenced by continental European urban design. A vision that, while celebrated by architectural historians ever since for its ambition, ultimately proved politically and practically impossible to fully implement, given the pressing need to rebuild quickly and the complex web of existing property rights and boundaries that predated the fire and that most owners insisted on having respected in the reconstruction that followed. In practice, London was largely rebuilt along its original medieval street pattern, though with crucial and lasting safety improvements mandated by the Rebuilding of London Act passed by Parliament in 1667, which required, among other measures, that new buildings be constructed primarily of brick or stone rather than timber, that street widths be increased to reduce the risk of fire spreading easily between buildings, and that the dangerous overhanging upper stories that had characterized so much of pre-fire London construction be prohibited entirely going forward. Christopher Wren did, however, receive the Historic Commission to design and oversee the reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral itself, along with dozens of the destroyed parish churches across the city, and his resulting design for the new St. Paul's, featuring its famous and instantly recognizable dome, remains more than 3 centuries later one of London's most iconic and celebrated architectural landmarks, a building whose construction took several decades to complete, but that stands today as perhaps the single most enduring physical legacy of the disaster that necessitated its creation. The Great Fire of London also left behind a lasting monument in the most literal sense, with the construction, completed in 1677, of a tall commemorative column near the fire's point of origin at Pudding Lane, designed by Wren in collaboration with the scientist Robert Hooke, and known simply as the Monument to the Great Fire of London, standing precisely 202 feet tall, a height chosen specifically because it represents the exact distance between the monument's location and the site of Farriner's original bakery on Pudding Lane, where the fire began. A structure that remains open to visitors today and continues to serve as London's principal memorial to the catastrophe. Financing the enormous cost of rebuilding presented its own considerable challenge, ultimately addressed through a novel tax imposed on coal brought into the city, a levy that fell disproportionately on ordinary Londoners who relied on coal for heating and cooking, but that succeeded in raising substantial revenue over the following decades to fund not only the reconstruction of St. Paul's and the parish churches, but also broader civic improvements, including new quays along the Thames and improvements to the city's water supply infrastructure, a funding mechanism that remained in place in various adjusted forms for well over a century after the fire itself had become a distant memory for most Londoners. Beyond its immediate physical and architectural legacy, the Great Fire of London helped catalyze significant and lasting developments in the emerging field of fire insurance and urban fire prevention more broadly. In the years following the disaster, the world's first fire insurance company, established by a businessman named Nicholas Barbin, began offering policies to London property owners, and fire insurance companies of this era, in the decades that followed, developed their own private fire brigades to protect insured properties an early and imperfect precursor to the organized, publicly funded municipal fire services that would eventually become standard in cities around the world, developments whose roots can be traced directly back to the hard lessons London learned in the smoking ruins left behind by 4 catastrophic days in September of 1666, a fire that began with an ember in a baker's oven and ended by permanently transforming how one of the world's great cities understood, prepared for, and ultimately rebuilt itself against the ever-present danger of fire. More than 3 centuries have passed since the Great Fire of London, yet its legacy still stands in the city's streets, its architecture, and the lessons it taught the world about rebuilding after disaster. A single spark in a bakery changed one of the greatest cities on earth forever, proving that history is often shaped not only by kings and wars, but by ordinary moments with extraordinary consequences. We hope you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most remarkable events. If you stayed with us until the end, thank you. Your support means a lot and helps the Retro Review continue bringing history to life. If you enjoyed this documentary, please leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more stories that change the world. And don't forget to tell us in the comments which historical event you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because history is never just about yesterday. It's about understanding today and shaping tomorrow. Thanks for watching.